It was a culmination of years of personal and political struggle. And while January 10th, 1967 broke the bonds of oppression of the black majority in the Bahamas, it also presented an opportunity for real democracy. But 53 years later, have we lived up to the hope and promise expected from majority rule? We discuss in this edition of the Reid Factor. My special guests are Barry Griffin, an attorney at law who is also National Vice Chair of the Progressive Liberal Party, Rosalie Fox, who is the daughter of Sir Randall Fox, one of the key players in the majority rule journey, and Mr. Michael Smith, who is the chairman of the Broadcasting Corporation, who also served as a High Commissioner for the Bahamas to Canada and also a Member of Parliament. Welcome to the Reid Factor.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Now, Mr. Smith, we'll start with you. 1967, 53 years ago. What are your recollections of what things were like in the Bahamas then?
Okay, I was a student at Government I leaving at that time, and it was a time of trying to achieve a number of goals. And key among that, at that particular time, was to have, we had internal self-government in 1964, and the Progressive Liberal Party had just lost the election around that time, but felt that they should have won, and it was well known that the mandate, if they won, was to first of all have majority rule, and then to move toward independence. So it was a sort of a goal-setting and goal-achieving time for those who were aware. And there were a lot of people who were actually aware. There was great interest in the development of the country from people who met around the meeting places of the time. In some cases churches, in some cases bars, in some cases just spots that people gathered, but there was a lot of conversation about moving the Bahamas forward.
Now, prior to 1967, because you hear so many people talk about the level of oppression that Bahamians felt, particularly black Bahamians, or poor Bahamians generally, did you experience any of that?
Well, there was, you almost knew your place kind of thing, in that you didn't, there was a significant amount of oppression just prior to my generation. It had eased a bit, but still, you have to remember at that time, we had visitors like Colin Powell, not Colin Powell, the congressman from the
Adam Clayton Powell?
Adam Clayton Powell is the one I'm trying to remember. Even Martin Luther King Jr. came here. We had people of that ilk who was involved with the American struggle,
and that definitely
they had a lot of influence in the Bahamian society, and a lot of Bahamians had gone to the contract to work. And so when they came back, they were also involved in the struggle, like Clarence Bain, for example.
Now, they say that the road to majority rule began with the Burma Road riots in 1942. Care to give a little bit of history to our viewers who may not be so aware of that?
Well, it was a progressive series of steps. The riots evolved from an awareness that we were being not treated fairly. The workmen were not getting the same salaries as the expatriate work people, and that was certainly caused a lot of disgruntlement. And you had some really good Bahamian carpenters and tradespeople, even though they may not have been classified as such technically. But in addition to that, as people saw that their rights were being violated in different spheres, they came together to fight against it. And so you had that, and then you had the push for the women's vote, you had Black Tuesday, you had all of these things sequentially. And eventually, the awareness was to the place where, listen, we need to take over this situation.
Mm-hmm. Now, Rosalie, your father was one of two people who actually changed the vote, and if you will, turned the vote over in favor for the Progressive Liberal Party for majority rule to actually be what it was. Do you remember what that was like in 1967, and the sort of temperament of your father around that time?
Yes, I have very vivid recollections of 1967. I was 13 years of age at the time and had never really been interested in politics. I always knew that Dad was a member of the House of Assembly, but my parents did a very good job of shielding us from all of the controversy that surrounded his life. And I don't even have any recollection of what led up to the 67 election. But when the tie occurred, there was great excitement. And I would say that 67 was one of the best years of my life because life changed for the family.
How?
How did it change? Yes. Well, first of all, I remember when it was all hanging in the balance and people were coming to the house, all right? And my mom always related the story of how she was in the House of Labor on Wolf Road. And there's a corridor, and her office was on one side and Dad's office was on the other side. And they were in the office when the call came in from Sir Rowland, and she was the one that took the call. Yes, and he greeted her and asked to speak with my father. So she went across and told him to take up the extension, but she never hung up. So she was the one who was always able to testify that she heard the offer, name your terms. Yes, but how did life change for us? Oh, goodness. Dad was, what can I say? He was exuberant. He was so happy. And we started to travel with him. I remember going to Exuma to open one of the hotels there. And there was a trip to New York. We stayed at the Regency Hotel. These are memories of a child. And that was exciting, the suite in which we lived. And he went there to encourage Bahamians who were living abroad to come back home to the Bahamas and build a nation. And P. Anthony White was one of the persons who responded. I remember persons like Jackie Robinson coming to the house several times. And we were part of the conversation. Dad would always say, come down and play the piano, which I never liked too much. But that was the kind of life. There was a lot of social life. I remember Mom going to West Palm Beach. She met with Hubert Humphrey and coming back and talking about the Outriders. So it was the red carpet treatment for that year, and I relished it.
Now, you mentioned the call from Sir Rowland.
Yes.
How difficult, I'm sure you spoke with your dad
Yes.
as you grew up a little bit more. How difficult a decision was it for him? Was it difficult at all?
Oh, not at all. In fact,
Because I'm sure the offer must have
he
been
always would say,
really quite enticing.
they offered me $1 million, but I turned it, but I don't think they actually named the figure. But he was full of pride over the fact that he declined the offer. And so for him, it was monumental, the fact that he decided to give his vote to his people and that he refused that. He prided himself on his integrity. Yes.
And of course, Sir Alvin Brennan was the other person who was key in that
Yes.
that role. But
Yes.
did your father ever discuss where the conversations that he and Sir Alvin had?
No, he never discussed that, no, not
Great.
at all.
Well, Barry Griffin, you're hearing now from people who are just a little bit older than you about it. But as a young Bahamian, what does majority rule mean to you?
As a young Bahamian, I think majority rule marked a bright point in our history. It's something that we as young Bahamians can point to where the tides changed and we can see the progression of our various families. Because me, for example, I would have a grandfather who was only educated to a 6th grade level. He was born pre-majority rule, but now he has grandkids who are doctors and lawyers. And so we can all point to majority rule as that point in time when the tides began to change for people who looked like us, whether they were poor Bahamians or black Bahamians. Pre-majority rule there was but one high school in the country, so most Bahamians couldn't have been educated. Post-majority rule, the government, the Progressive Liberal Party, went about on a course of creating high schools across the country. And so that's when you began to see Bahamians of all stripes being educated. So as a young Bahamian, although majority rule is far in the past, I think the strands of the history that have been told, we can link what happened in 1967 to our successes as a people today.
Now, it's good that you feel that way, but do you think the vast majority of people in your age group consider it that way? Do they even know what majority rule is?
That's what I was going to say. Those who know the history or have grandparents or family members who would tell them the history, I think they recognize the significance of it. But I think the general conversation around most Bahamians is the fact that young Bahamians, quite frankly, don't know much of our history. We have inklings of what went on, but I don't think we do enough as a society to educate our young people on our history, because without a doubt, I feel like the present generation is one of the most progressive and socially conscious generations we've ever had. We are very in tune in what's going on, not just here, but around the world. And so if we know our history the way we know sort of a lot of things that happen in the United States, I think we'll feel a sense of pride in what happened here, but also a sense of some sort of mission in the Bahamas for our own fate.
Now, Mike Smith and Rosalie Fox, would you agree with that? Being more in tune than because I thought that back in the day they were very politically astute.
Well, I think that they probably have a wider world consciousness, but I don't think they have a local consciousness. I find that young people generally don't listen to the news. If they do get it, they get it sporadically on social media, and in most instances social media is warped and not properly documented. The other thing is, yes, they are more educated, but I am not sure that they have a true appreciation for Bahamianism.
Yes. I feel that they need to know the history, but today you have to think of where our young people are. They're on social media. I have tried, there are many of us who are trying to get the history out there. And I guess we're just working as one man or one woman bands. But nevertheless, we have to use the social media to tell the story. In the Bible, there's a verse that speaks to that. We have to keep telling the story. And because you tell it one year, it doesn't mean that it's going to hold for the next year. You have to keep getting that story out there and using whatever means to achieve that.
Do you think that young people just take it for granted and really just have an expectation that they're supposed to get whatever they get and more?
I would not characterize it exactly that way, but where I would agree with you is that one of the perhaps beauties or one of the deficiencies of majority rule is that the country did in fact change. And so the struggles that for example, my grandparents or persons of that generation would have gone through because of their struggles and what they fought for, people in my generation don't have to deal with it. And so those struggles are so far gone from our present day consciousness, we don't perhaps appreciate what it took to get where we are. But that's a blessing in the sense that we don't have to deal with that and we can now move on to the struggles of today. I guess one of the negative things of that is that we don't quite frankly appreciate the history of what has happened, and that's where I guess previous generations I guess would need to, as she said, you need to continually tell the history. Every year someone tells me, there are thousands of Bahamians that graduate high school. So every year, you have thousands of new young adults going about in society, and so it's a continual thing of educating Bahamians on our history.
Thank you very much. Sorry, we have to take a break right now, but we'll be back. Come right back to you. Stay with us. We have more on the Reid Factor. Welcome back. We're talking about majority rule, and before the break, Barry Griffin was addressing whether young people actually know enough or care enough, and I think you wanted to respond to him, Rosalie Fox.
Yes. In terms of our history, we need to celebrate it more. I just came back from a trip to South Africa, and wherever I went in Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela was there. There were monuments, there were museums, there were statues. I went into Soweto, I went to the Apartheid Museum. Where do we take our children, okay? For instance, I have a huge collection of documents, memorabilia, artifacts left by Surrando. I really don't want to place them into the archives where they will be buried. They should be displayed for persons coming to the country. We need national support. I've tried to do a lot on Facebook. We had a website going at one time, but we need national support from our governments. Most people can't do what I'm doing because it's time consuming. Maybe they don't have the funds to do it, all right? But each one of us has a part or a piece of the puzzle. We have documents, photographs in our homes. I remember when they were setting up the museum in Washington, the African American Museum, there was a call all around the world. Do you have something that we can put into this museum? And things started coming in so fast, they couldn't even attend to all that was offered.
And the truth is, there are a lot of cultural and historical riches that the Bahamas has to offer, and we
Yes.
need to present
Yes.
beyond majority rule.
Yes, yes, so it needs to be celebrated, it needs to be highlighted, and it needs to be sustained.
As an educator, do you think we need to tweak our curriculum, perhaps, to promote
Yes.
more awareness?
I'm a little out of touch, you know, I think it's been some decades since I taught, you know, but, so I'm not familiar with the curriculum
current, yeah.
today. But I do know that even when Surrando was alive, students were calling him, they were asking for information, they were asking for interviews, and I do get a lot of offers to speak in schools and to do PowerPoint presentations. But oftentimes the response is, I never knew that. Even the teachers will tell you that they never heard it, and they thank me for coming in and enlightening them and sharing with them. And so if there could be a place, because I can't be everywhere, but if there could be a central place. I remember when I went to the Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, what impressed me, every few minutes buses were coming, school children were coming, visitors were coming, and it just never stopped. And I think we need to have that kind of center where people can go any day, any time,
And agree.
be a part of the history.
But even though there is so much on display like that in the United States, there's still a great number of young people who are completely unaware of
Yes.
these important things. So there's got to be other ways of ensuring that people have become aware. But Mike Smith, I want you to talk a little bit more about the successes since 1967,
Sure.
53 years ago.
Well, the first thing I want to say is, what is majority rule?
Absolutely, we should.
You know, there was always this black majority rule, which is somewhat erroneous, in the sense that you have to appreciate that there was a time when you had not one man, one vote, nor did you have one woman, any vote.
True.
And you had the company vote. So initially, if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote, which means that was probably 20% of the country.
And if you had 4 pieces of land in 4 different islands, you could vote 4 times, right?
I remember seeing Sir Stafford Sand's office, which is where Scotia Bank is, just before Roslyn Square. He had an office there, and he must have had 50 different company plaques displayed there, which meant that he probably could have voted 50 times, or certainly lots and lots of times.
Yeah.
So you had the company vote, you had the property vote. Women were not allowed to vote. So majority rule means one person, one vote, and equal say in the running of your country. I think that is extremely significant.
Absolutely.
In terms of progress, yes. I went to government high school when it was the only high school, the only government high school in the country. And I had to come from Abaco, where they didn't have a high school, come to Nassau, study for the entrance exam for a year at Western Senior. Luckily I passed, because they only accepted 90 people out of the whole country to go there. And also There was, of course, at the time, St. Augustine's College, St. John's College a little later, but there were only 5 high schools in the entire country. The great success is that the Progressive Liberal Party administration, you have to acknowledge that they built high schools throughout the country. Now, it's also to remember that Sir Cecil Wallace Whitfield, the founder of the Free National Movement, was the Minister of Education.
Absolutely.
When most of that took place. So this is why we can't just put majority rule in a PLP lump or an FNM lump.
How do we depoliticize this whole idea?
By
'Cause that's a problem
recognizing-
that we have every year.
By recognizing that men like Sir Cecil, men like Sir Arthur Folkes, men like Warren Leverity, men like Mr. Macmillan, were all integral parts of the Progressive Liberal Party in the struggle.
Absolutely.
But they had a policy difference with Sir Lyndon later on, and split, and eventually that's how the UBP, that's how the FNM came about. Oh, no. That's how the FNM came about. UBP came about after the PLP established a party in
That's right.
53.
And actually, that's the thing. A lot of people may not know that the actual PLP was formed before the UBP.
That's right.
Right.
1953, the PLP was formed, and then a few years later,
Right.
because you moved to party government, the UBP formed.
Right.
And then eventually, because of the split in policy between Sir Cecil and people who were aligned with him and Sir Lyndon, then that's how you eventually got the Free National Movement. There were other smaller developments in between, like the BDP, et cetera,
Right,
and Mr. Paul Adley's party, et cetera. But eventually it became the Free National
I'm going to take you back just a little bit because you were talking around 67 and you were from Abaco.
Yes.
You moved to New Providence. What was the difference between those communities at that time?
Well, the irony is, Abaco at that time was the people were reasonably poor, but we still had a good life. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Be poor and happy.
Yeah,
Because you hear people saying, well, we were poor but didn't know it.
Well, you had enough to eat because you had seafood, you had, stuff that you grew in the farms, and then you always had farms in Abaco. So you had, people growing vegetables and cucumbers and citrus, etc. So there was no problem for food. But then in the government system, you only had an all-age school. The school I went to up until till primary, everybody was in one room, and you had a corner. You had corners, right? And then eventually, of course, look at what we have today. So that is significant progress. I remember when I was born, my mother had complications, so they had to fly me to Nassau in a seaplane to come to the Princess Margaret Hospital. Wow. So we had to row out from the dock in a little dinghy to the seaplane. Then she had to fly with the nurse to Princess Margaret. Not to Princess Margaret, it was the one out west at the time. I forget the name.
Was it the General Hospital or something like that?
No, it wasn't General. It's the one even before that.
Oh, wow.
It was just there by the waterworks, just west of the waterworks out there. So I was born there, and 2 weeks later I went back. But I'm saying that's the kind of problem with services and medical support, et cetera, et cetera. The library, my mother was a librarian, and they only met for 2 hours a week to get your books. And the books were sent on the mail boat by the Ranfurly Library. Lady Ranfurly, the Governor General's wife, established that. And like I said, my mother was a librarian, so I had access to all kind of stuff that came in, like the National Geographic Life magazine and these kind. But that was what life was like then. So you come to Government High, and you're a step up because you've got science labs, you're interacting with some of the smartest people in the country, and it was just continuous progress from there. With politics playing roles, yes, but it was more the people and their aspirations, in my view. Some had differences, like Sir Cecil had differences, Sir Lyndon had differences.
Yeah, but that's...
But that's politics. But generally, there was this constant progression. And when I hear people say nothing has happened in 50 years, all I can do is just sit back and smile, because hey, man,
a whole lot has happened.
A whole lot has happened in 50 years.
Yeah. Well, talking about your mother, you mentioned your mother and her role, her partnership with your father in the work that they were doing. And then to hear, of course, that only in 1962 women got the right to vote. Right. Can you imagine now if we had a situation like that where women could not exercise their rights to vote?
To vote,
What
yes.
kind of world would that be in the Bahamas, huh?
Yes, I do. I don't have too many recollections of the women's suffrage movement,
No, no.
but I do remember Dr. Doris Johnson coming to the house often and getting literature from Dad, all right, and he regarded her highly.
Yeah. Now, as far as you're concerned, Mr. Griffin, right? I think the next phase, this is what we always hear about, that, okay, we've got through this political success and political freedom, if you will, or independence. Now we need economic independence. What are your comments on that?
I would exactly agree. One of the things that I most remember in folks telling the story is that when Sir Lyndon demitted office, one of the things that he said was that what he was very proud about of his legacy and the legacy of the PLP was the fact that they were able to bring political independence to the country and perhaps social independence. But one of his biggest regrets was that they unfortunately failed to bring that sort of economic independence to the people. And I feel as though young people today see that as the next frontier. We have an equal stake in politics in our country. We can see that through the faces of our prime ministers and the faces of the people who represent us. Socially, we can see that we've improved. But I think the last sticking point is that when you talk to young people today, they don't feel as though we have an equal share in the economic patrimony of our country.
And what exactly does that mean?
I think, quite frankly, that means ownership. You hear the stories of when Sir Milo took Sir Lyndon to Bay Street and demanded that the banks hire black folks, because previously the only blacks in the banks would have been janitors and things of that nature. So we achieved that, and we now have persons like myself who work in the financial services industry. But how many banks in this country are Bahamian owned? That's the next frontier.
But let me ask you
we
this,
staff
though.
tourism. How many major hotels in the country are Bahamian owned?
But why is that? Is that because why do you think that is?
Quite frankly, I think it's
I mean, for
our-
example, in Haiti, right, you have a cartel that bought out Royal Bank, Soje Bank. It's a major success. Why have Bahamians not been able to do that?
I think part of the reason, I think it's a lot of reasons.
Or is
but,
it you think it's too risky a business?
No, part of it, I think it's quite frankly our...
I mean, we do have Bahamian banks. I mean, Commonwealth Bank is one of the best banks we have in this country.
And yes, and I said how many.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is I think the economic system of the Bahamas, we continue to run what people have dubbed the Sir Stafford model, which was created from before majority rule, where we place a heavy reliance on foreign direct investment, where we have a very restrictive foreign exchange regime, where basically if you're a foreigner and you come to the country, there are many things that are afforded to you in terms of exemptions and you basically get the red carpet treatment to start businesses, but those same incentives aren't offered to Bahamians. And so now I think Bahamians have said this model has benefited us for many years, but the world is changing and we need a new model. We need a model where Bahamians are at the center of our economic development.
Got to stop you right there. We have to take a break. We'll be back with more on the Reid Factor. Stay with us. Welcome back. 53 years of majority rule. The political phase has been successful. We need to move deeper into an economic phase of independence. And just before the break, Barry Griffin, you had some comments about the need for a shift or a new model. Mr. Smith, I think you had a response for this.
One of the things I wanted, it's my experience, even though I'm not in financial services, but it seems to me there is a lot of ignorance among Bahamian young business people as to what exemptions they can get, what benefits they can tap into. They don't seem to really have a knowledge of what the incentives that are available. And I think more time needs to be spent by young aspiring business people and really researching what is available to them. Now, maybe if you have a different experience, Mr. Griffin, I don't know, but that's the impression that I get.
I think the reality is not just in financial services, but when you talk about any industry in this country, it is much easier for a foreigner to achieve their business successes in the Bahamas. And that's the purpose of the Bahamas Investment Authority. If you are a foreign national and you want to have a business here, it's based out of the office of the Prime Minister, and everything goes through there. You submit your plan there, and the red carpet is rolled out. You have a direct link to the Cabinet of the Bahamas and government agencies so that your businesses can be facilitated. You see it in the Commercial Enterprises Act, another new piece of legislation, again, that rolls out the red carpet for foreigners. And so the thing that I think
But
young
only foreigners, or is it based on the amount that the business is going to be worth, or the amount of money that is involved in the business?
Well, those two pieces that I'm speaking about, those are particularly for foreign persons. Again, the crux of our economic model is foreign direct investment. And so what I'm saying is there's nothing wrong with that, and we do need foreign direct investment, and that plays a crucial part in our development. But we've come to a point where Bahamians see that, and we want to have a larger stake in our economy. Those same red carpet things that are laid out to other folks, we want to get those as well. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find young Bahamians who don't think that. And so, like I said, the economic model has benefited us greatly, but I think it's time in our development that we begin to think of a shift. How are we moving into the 21st century? Is our economic model benefiting us to these new industries that are being created? We're talking about legalizing marijuana. Are we thinking of how we can ensure that this is an industry that is owned by Bahamians, or it's going to be put into the same Stafford Sands model where we allow outsiders to come in and sort of monopolize that industry? So I think young people are saying, yes, we've benefited, but if we want to have true majority rule, true economic independence, the government needs to particularly focus on how we as Bahamians can benefit and get a deeper piece of the pie.
Well, obviously we always have to look at innovative ways, right, to change. You always need new economic plans. But, one thing that distresses me more than anything else, right, is to hear young Bahamians who are becoming professionally qualified or certified saying, oh, I ain't going back to the Bahamas because ain't nothing there for me. I ain't got nothing to do there. And then their parents say, I tell them don't come back either. It distresses me to no extent. And I'll be honest with you, when I finished college, I was one of those who said I wasn't coming back either, but I've spent really all of my life either in the Bahamas or working for the Bahamas and the Bahamian people, and proud to have done it. But how do we, because the way the world is now, you can still do a lot of work for the Bahamas and not be here all the time. How do we make new opportunities like that? How do we embrace those opportunities?
I think we have a large and growing diaspora that needs to be tapped into. The reality is the borders around the world, they're becoming porous. If you are educated or you are wealthy, the world is your oyster today. And so you will have what a lot of people call brain drain. There are going to be Bahamians who decide to live elsewhere. But I think the important thing is we have lots of Bahamians doing great things abroad, and it's important for our government and for our people to continually engage them so that one day the experiences, the opportunities, the connections, the network that they make, they're able to assist the Bahamas in some way. One of the things, I was on a show yesterday and we were talking about foreign affairs. One of a country's greatest foreign affairs apparatus are the people who they have abroad. Bahamians are meeting folks from all over the world, and who's to say a Bahamian descendant or a Bahamian national abroad can't bring foreign direct investment to the country or find ways for Bahamians to partner in businesses abroad. Well, so we need to use that diaspora.
There is some success in that, in the sense that the government established a database, particularly in Atlanta, based in Atlanta, for Bahamians abroad, because that was considered the most central point for Bahamians' involvement. And I'm not sure if people are aware, but it's having some success in that. Let's look at the Standards Bureau. The lady who heads that has a PhD, studied abroad, worked for international companies abroad, and now she's back home heading that. Then, I know BPL is a dirty word to a lot of people, but there's people involved in that who've come back home. And you will find it's probably not as well known as it should be, but there are quite a number of Bahamians who are now coming back to assist. having spent considerable time abroad. So to me, that's a positive. The other thing I see as a positive, and particularly now, is that there's considerably more entrepreneurship among younger people in the Bahamas. For example, I have a 40-year-old son, and most of his friends are entrepreneurs, and they're doing quite well. They did the college thing and all of that, but they are now entrepreneurs and have started their own businesses and are thriving. So I think there is not probably as much knowledge of what is really going on. And people are still stuck in that, don't come back here, that kind of thing. But I'm finding that the ones who do come back, or who still maintain a linkage, are being successful at a number of things.
Well, it's just like pressure from young people could make the change for what they want, right?
Exactly, yes.
As far as the systems are concerned. Now, Rosalie, tell me, because you knew your father obviously very well, what do you think he would be saying now about where we are as a country, 53 years after majority rule?
Well, if you think about Surrando, there was the change in 1967. Things did not go very well for him after 67. We had the death of Uriah McPhee, and instead of calling a by-election, Sir Lyndon called a general election. And I read some of his writings where he said Sir Lyndon and those fought him as though he was the devil himself. And after they got an overwhelming majority, and this came right out of the blue, they obviously didn't see a need for having this majority of one. And so his ministerial appointment was revoked. And so there was that disillusionment with Surrando. And there was what he saw as a downward spiral. And I don't know if you recall his marching in the 80s and the 90s with his banner,
Yes, I do.
Righteousness exalteth the nation. There were many books that he was trying to write, I can see from all the notes that were left behind. One of them had to do with the pension case, and there was another one called Spoilers of the Dream. And so he really didn't like, I'm not saying that the successive governments were not able to achieve certain things, but he really did not like the direction in which he saw the country going. And he tried to speak out. He tried to run in the general elections that followed 1972, but he wasn't successful because people started to vote strictly along party lines. And so you're thinking in terms of what would Dad say? I think he was disillusioned.
And do you think he still would be, had he been here?
Yes, because I'm disillusioned myself.
Wow.
You know, now that's not to say, I think when we look at history, there's a tendency to focus on one thing, you know, or I don't like what this prime minister did or the next one did, and so we just magnify that. But when we look at history, we have to look at the good, and we have to look at things that are not so good. And there's a tendency in this country to sanitize history. We talk about all of the successes, but there were many failures. There were many colossal things that went wrong with all of our governments, and they tend to be pushed under the carpet, so to speak.
And really there's nothing wrong with failures, it's just a matter of
and we
remembering them so you can actually
learn from the mistakes.
There you go, that's
you
what I was
see?
saying.
So we're having talks today about web shops and casinos. The talk was around in the 1960s, 67 election. That whole election was based on casino gambling. Are we really learning from the lessons of history? And so when we look at history, I think we have to not just focus on what went wrong or what went right, but all of these men were successful, but there were mighty failures as well. And so we have to tell, and I think this is one of the reasons too, why history is not being preserved and recorded as it should, because people are ashamed of the history. They're ashamed of it. And so they say, rather than write my story, I'll just leave it alone and I'll go to my grave with the knowledge in my head. And so we have to, you know, not just celebrate the victories and the good parts about majority rule, but there were many failures.
Do you think we can move on if we don't acknowledge what we did wrong?
No, because we're still making the same mistakes, so to speak. And even though I like the perspectives from these two gentlemen, if you are on social media, there's a lot of discontent, and people are not happy, all right? And this doesn't have to do with PLP, FNM. We talk about the diaspora and about people going abroad, not coming back, their parents telling them, don't come back here, you know? I've heard many stories. People are trying to come back. They want to come back. They write, they don't even get responses. So there's that frustration that exists in people who are part of the diaspora, all right? The ease of doing business in the Bahamas is not good.
Agreed.
You know, everywhere you go to take care of a simple matter, you're turned about,
there's a lot of red
come
tape,
back,
yeah.
you know? And this is what is happening with people who are trying to come back. So after a while, they just give up, you know? And even like well, I better not say what I was going to say, but even I told somebody I was coming on the show, and they were like, oh, you're wasting your time, nothing will change. But I said, well, I'll go and represent Dad, you know, for what it's worth. So as I say, there's this disillusionment that I'm not even going to try any further. And one of the things, too...
But what happens to a country like that when people say they're not going to try
First of
anymore?
all, I want to just finish, because I know others have to speak, but in this country, genius is buried, all right? Once you are perceived of as not being a yes person, they don't want you in politics. If you have the capacity to think, to analyze, you're not really wanted. They want people who are going to toe the line. And so you see many people who, prior to entering politics, they have something to say. But once they become elected or they're given a position, and this is how you get those radicals out of the system, give them a position and you silence them.
Wow.
You follow me?
I think we're going to have to take our final break on that one, and then we're going to get some more perspectives and hopefully some suggestions how we move forward to make the Bahamas even better. Stay with us, please. It's 2020, a new decade, 53 years after majority rule. How do we advance? How do we move forward? Barry Griffin, I think you had some words in response to Rosalie Fox.
Yes.
Before the break.
Ms. Fox, first I would like to say thank you for coming on the show. You said it might have been a bit dangerous for you, but I think these are the types of conversations that we need to have. Young people, I think, are in agreement with you in terms of we don't want a sanitized version of our history. We want to know exactly what happened in terms of the triumphs and the failures. And in a question you asked before in terms of depoliticizing the history of majority rule. Majority rule was a deeply political time in our country, and I think when you start with the notion of depoliticizing it...
No. I think you're misunderstanding what I mean by depoliticizing.
No, I mean, you just asked the question, and so I just wanted to say it's important to keep that political part of it. Our country was in a deep political struggle, and so that is all part of the story. And I think when you begin to sanitize and whitewash the history, that's when the importance is lost on future generations, and so they don't see the importance because the struggle and the realness of the story is perhaps mixed. In addition to the legacies of a lot of our founding fathers, like your father, when you don't tell the full story about how he became disillusioned, that's when we become disillusioned, because we're living in a time now, as you said, there's a lot of discontentment around the country. So I think we're all proud and happy to be Bahamians, and we're proud of the success. But Bahamians are in a state now where we're looking for a way forward. And I think if we look at history in terms of majority rule, we can get some insight into how previous generations of Bahamians overcame struggles and how perhaps we can use that as an example of how we can overcome our struggles of today.
Mike Smith?
I just wanted to respond to the efficiency aspect of doing business in the country. And that is, I think, a real challenge. It's not political at all. It's problematic among ourselves. What I mean by that is, if you try to go to most government offices, the people, for the most part, are not as enthusiastic to serve you as they should be.
Yes.
There is a tremendous lack of inefficiency. and a lack of pride in their work. You do have a lot of good professional public servants, but you have a lot of clerks who do not perform at the level that we need in terms of efficiency.
Yes.
For example, I know of an example this past week. Someone was trying to get a business license. They sent everything that was needed. So now you go in to try and get the license, and the clerk saunters over in slippers and probably chewing a piece of bread and saying, there ain't no attachment to the file. And that's it. So
And just dismisses
Just
of you.
dismiss it. I mean, and there was an attachment to the file.
But that's
They didn't even bother
Look.
Yeah.
to look.
Yes.
It's a lack of pride in your work. It's a lack of
They like to
efficiency.
send
But
you away.
that is probably the biggest problem I think we have to overcome.
Yeah,
because
exactly, in
I
our
remember
country.
20, 30 years ago when we were really quite good at customer service. Now it's like we're failing all around in it, and I don't know why that is.
Yes. I just
But,
wanted
okay,
to
so how do we change that, though? How do
Well,
we change
just,
this and move
I
forward?
want to say one thing too about our history, right? The revision of history starts with the politicians, you know, and they omit, they change around, they don't tell the full story. That has been my experience. This is just not a theoretical comment, all right? I have heard it, I have seen it, I have witnessed it. And after Sarandon died, it was like they were trying to wipe him out totally without calling names. But the one thing that saved his legacy was that he documented. He kept records. He took photographs. And prior to his death, he kept his own legacy. He didn't even give instructions to us as to what to do. But when I witnessed it firsthand, you know, the wiping out of his legacy, I decided I have the documentation to refute this. And at that time, I didn't know anything about websites, and I think when he died, I didn't even know about emails. But after I saw how expensive it was to keep the legacy going, I quickly acquired these skills, and I started to put the information out there. So the point I'm trying to make is the whitewashing of history starts with our politicians. And so if they're going to bury it, if they're going to change it, if they're not going to recognize it or celebrate it, what do we expect the average man on the street to do?
But can we put pressure on the politicians by virtue of the public not accepting that?
Well, what I do, I don't really try to change governments anymore. If I'm going to do something, I try to do it myself,
That is my point.
or find
Yeah.
somebody who can help me
That is my
to get what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Because this knocking on doors, I think well, my
So
time has come and
really
gone
what
for
we're
that.
saying is that the people are looking at the politicians when really the people should be putting the pressure on the politicians.
Exactly.
Or
Get what they want done.
we don't always have to look to government for everything. I think
Exactly.
there's this
That's the next thing,
dependency.
an overdependence.
If the government isn't
Exactly.
doing this, the
Exactly.
government, do it yourself, or find a group of like-minded persons who can support whatever it is you're doing. And you will find that even as a one-man person or a one-woman person or just two or three, that if you are enthusiastic about it, you're passionate about it, the job will get done to an extent, all right? But I think you just have to. And I think that's one of the good things about Sarandon not continuing on in politics was that it gave him a new goal, and that was to document his life story in the faith that moved the mountain.
Now, just because we are running out of time,
Yes.
but we have about 5 minutes left, but I will give you an opportunity now to tell people who don't know about Sarandon where they could find out information from him,
Yes.
about him.
Well, we had a website, but for various reasons, we had to let it go. We were not getting the technical support that we needed. But we still have a Facebook page. And for Majority Rule, I will be putting up his writings, The Faith That Moved the Mountain, digital copies. And people will be able to have free downloads. You can go to Facebook, Sarandon Forks, and the Bahamas Federation of Labor. And on Friday, you will be able to, you can scroll down and see what's there and just take and help yourself to whatever.
And Mike Smith, how do we move forward, and what would you like to see as the country continues to progress?
I would like to see us take more pride in what we do. I think that is the core of our problem. There's a tremendous amount of laziness, in my view, in the country. Because you have access to all of these modern technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we as Bahamians, in my view, need to become more efficient. And I'm happy to see now, even though it's taken much too long, the government moving in that direction. We're automating the passport office. You know, we're automating the immigration department. The computerizing is what I mean when I say,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
And we're doing this now in a lot of other departments. So within another year or so, we should be able to do most of our customs, etc., most of our stuff online. So we're moving in that direction. But I still think there is an innate slothfulness and inefficiency among Bahamian workers. You can see it. I was passing the point one day, and there were 5 expatriate workers, and they were working their butts off. And the 2 Bahamians that were there, one had us leaning up, eating a chocolate bar, and the next one had a soda, watching the other people work. It's a problem we've got to solve.
Not only that, you notice how many people, I mean, and I hate to say this, but how many people actually on the streets are just so willing to ask you for money instead of asking you if there's something they could do to earn money. They just want you to give it to them.
And this is not politics.
No, this is something about us.
This is self-pride and efficiency, you know.
But I don't even think they are aware that they should not be behaving in that manner. It's so ingrained, you know.
How do we move forward, Barry Griffin?
I wish that over the coming months and years that we as a people, and starting from a grassroots level, begin to craft a new grand vision for our country. In listening to folks recall history and in reading history, you get a sense that at the time of majority rule, there was some vision, something that the Bahamian people aspired to. They all wanted better. They all wanted greatness for themselves and for their country. And so people bought into that vision and idea, and they worked together to achieve majority rule and then independence and then to create the country we know today. I get the sense that there either isn't that vision, or Bahamians haven't sufficiently bought into a new vision for our country. So I would like us to mature as a democracy and as a people and begin to together craft that vision that we all can buy into and move forward on.
Do you see critical as well, because I see it, a greater partnership between more seasoned people and junior people? Because I think sometimes, you know, younger people feel that I want to do it this way, and they have some skills and they have some know-how, but they don't have the experience to get them where they need to go.
Yep, that connection of wisdom and that sort of youthful vigor is needed. And I think if we do have that common vision, everyone has a stake in it, and so you're willing to work together, you know, Bahamians of all stripes.
Well, we've got 2 minutes. I'm going to ask you for your final comments, and we're going to come to Rosalie and end with Mike Smith. Your final comments, please.
Final comments. Thank you for having me on the show. I think as a young person, these discussions are very important to have. I agree with the sentiments of my fellow guests and panelists that young people do not sufficiently know the history of our country, and we need to know our history and begin to celebrate it more. So I'm happy to be part of things like this where we get to talk about our history and begin to celebrate it.
Rosalie Fox?
I would like to encourage people to value the history, not just of the country, but you have organizations, churches, institutions, associations, to be record keepers, all right? And to value the experiences and to record them as they're happening, because when people look back 10, 20, 30 years hence, they will be inspired by what happened in the past, whether it was for good or for good or for worse. They will be inspired. So to encourage people to document and record.
But indeed, we would believe that overall, it's been for the better.
Oh yeah, having had the opportunity to represent the Bahamas for 5 years in Canada and interacting with 120 different embassies and high commissions, the one thing that comes out to you is how much people respect the Bahamas. The other thing that comes out is if you look at the rankings in the United Nations of where the Bahamas are, we're always in the top 40 in every category. And to me, that's tremendous success. We've just got to pull up our boots and do even better and tie into the vision that Mr. Griffin talked about.
Great. Well, Barry Griffin, Rosalie Fox, and Mike Smith, thank you all for being on the Reid Factor.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you all for tuning in. Remember, this is our Bahamas, your Bahamas. Only you can make it work. We'll see you next time on the Reid Factor.